For our first square, the interlocking lattice, I'm going to be using my Carlton DK in that dark denim blue. So that is the same color that I used for the square that you see here. I'm also going to be using those Haya circulars with the 4-inch tips because my signature needles are in another project this month. So let's take a look at the pattern. For our interlocking lattice, we'll be casting on 31 stitches with color number 501 Seafoam. But again, you can choose whatever color you want, and I'm actually using a different yarn and a different color this month. You're then going to follow that chart and repeat the stitches between the red lines or the stars 4 times, and then you'll repeat the entire chart 3 times before you bind off. And there are some interesting stitches in this that we need to explore. I hope that you have your key printed out because we need to look at some of these stitch symbols that may be unfamiliar to us. So the 3 new stitches that we're going to look at are going to be the twist to left, the twist to right, and the 1/1 right cross. So when we look at our lovely key, we can see our twisted stitches are over here. So when we're doing a twist to left, we're going to cross the first stitch in front of the second stitch. We're going to purl 1 and knit 1. And for the twist to right, we're going to cross the second stitch in front of the first stitch. We're going to knit 1 and then purl 1. And when it comes to that 1/1 right cross, we're just going to slip 1 stitch to the back, knit a stitch, knit the stitch in front on the cable needle. So all we're doing is we're taking 2 stitches and we're changing their positions. And if it happens to be a purl stitch, then we have to purl it on the opposite position. And if it happens to be a knit stitch, we have to knit it on the opposite position. And if they're both knit stitches, then we're just changing and knitting them both. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my block and go ahead and work those first 2 rows so that we can start with row 3 and those twisted cable stitches so that I can really show you how that works in a close-up. So I cast on and I worked the first 2 rows of my interlocking lattice square, and now I'm going to go ahead and show you how to work row 3. So when we look at row 3, we have a slipped stitch and then a purl, and then we have that first cable, and this one is the twist to left. And to do that, we are just going to exchange the position of the purl stitch and the knit stitch, and then we'll purl a stitch, knit a stitch, because we're taking this purl and this knit and we are changing their places. So let's go ahead and look at that twist to left, slip the first stitch, purl the next stitch, and now let's go ahead and we have to swap the position of the knit stitch and the purl stitch here. So I'm going to take my needle and insert it in the back of the purl stitch, and then I am going to hold the knit stitch at the base, slide it off, put the knit stitch on first, and then the purl stitch, and then I am going to purl this stitch and knit the next. So now we've changed the positions of these 2 stitches, just like this. So now I'm going to purl 2, and then we're going to do a twist to right. And this time we're going to change the position of the knit stitch over that purl stitch, so we'll knit and then purl. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to take this stitch here, and I'm going to hold the base of that purl stitch so that it can't come off. And I'm going to use my needle to take that purl stitch and the knit stitch and swap them. And then I'll go ahead and knit one and purl one. So now we've done this. And you can see we've hit our red line, so it's time to go back to the beginning. So let's purl one stitch. And now we're going to exchange these two stitches again right here. So I'm going to go ahead and work that cable again. Going to insert my needle, slip the first stitch off and hold it, put it back on the needle, that's the knit stitch, and then move that purl back over to my left hand needle. I will then purl and knit that stitch, and then I have 2 purl stitches before I do another cable, so I will go ahead and purl 1 and 2. And now we're going to do that cable, but remember this is the opposite direction. So I will insert my needle tip under that knit stitch. I'm going to pinch the purl stitch and then very carefully slide it onto my needle, and then place that knit stitch back on my left hand needle, then knit a stitch and purl a stitch. So now we've successfully completed this repeat twice. You can just start to see those cables form. So now let's go back to the beginning of that repeat, and we're going to purl, and then we need to swap those stitches again. So I'll insert that needle tip into the back of the purl stitch, and then move that knit stitch, put the purl stitch back on the left hand needle, and then purl a stitch, knit a stitch, and we have 2 purls before we need to do the cable again. So I'll purl twice, and then it's time for that opposite cable. So I will go ahead and insert that needle tip under the knit stitch. I'm going to pinch that purl stitch between my fingers, carefully maneuver my needle into the purl stitch, slide the knit stitch back on, and then I will knit and purl. Then purl 1 because that's the start of the repeat again. Go ahead and switch the purl stitch and knit stitch for that twist 2 left, and then go ahead and work the knit and purl. Then purl the 2 stitches in the center and work the twist 2 right by moving the purl and the knit. And then I will go ahead and finish out with that last purl and a knit stitch. And that is your first row in pattern. So here I am, I'm ready for row 7, and you can see that we are going to slip that first stitch, purl 3, and then go ahead and do that 1/1 cable to the right. And what we're going to do is just change the position of those 2 knit stitches. So I'll slip that first stitch and I'll purl 1, 2, 3, which will set us up to do the 1/1 right crossing cable. So all I'm going to do is insert my needle tip under that second stitch, swap the position of those 2 stitches, and then knit them. And then I will go ahead and purl, and we're going to purl all the way to that next crossing of the cables. And I'll go just a little bit slower this time. So I'm going to insert that needle tip under the second stitch, pop the first stitch off, carefully slide it back onto the needle tip, And then we're going to slide that second stitch onto our needle and knit both of those stitches. And then we'll purl again all the way to our next cable crossing, where we will once again change the position of those stitches so that we can cross them. You can already see that cross where I've moved those 2 stitches in the first 2 repeats. So we're going to take that second stitch, move the first stitch off the needle, put it back on, put the second stitch back on, and then just knit both of those stitches again. And then we'll purl once more all the way over to our cable crossing, where we will take that second stitch and cross it over the first, putting the second stitch back on, and then we'll just go ahead and knit both of those stitches and then purl all the way to the last stitch, which we will knit. So now you have seen how to do the twist to the right, the twist to the left, and our 1/1 cable cross. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what it should look like once you finish the entire pattern repeat. Now that I have worked through the first 12 rows of the pattern repeat, you can see that the interlocking lattice is really starting to come to life. And once again, that is what it looks like when the block is all knit up. I hope you enjoyed learning how to do those very small cables with the twist to left, the twist to right, and the 1/1 right cross. So now that you have learned how to do some of those small cables, let's go ahead and take a look at our next block, that shadow cable, where we will be crossing more than 1 stitch over 1 stitch at a time. And I will once again show you my nifty trick for how to cable without a cable needle, even when you're working with 4 or more stitches. So let's go ahead and look at that shadow cable block.